Hello, welcome to the webinar Introduction to Holistic Judging Awards at HMUN India. My name is Colin Mark and I'm the Undersecretary General for Committees for HMUN India 2016. And I'm also the Director for the Historical General Assembly 1979 Committee. As a brief introduction of myself, I'm a senior at Harvard studying social studies, which is our interdisciplinary social sciences and social theory major, and I'm going to be working toward a thesis on the nation state as a unitary political actor. So looking at how nation states behave as a large group of people acting collectively. And the purpose of this webinar is to demystify how awards are given at HMUN India. I suspect this will be a very popular webinar, and I hope that this is a useful resource as you prepare to think about what it means to participate fully at HMUN India and what it is that your dais really is looking for from the delegates. So just to jump right in, first, we need to emphasize that we at HMUN really don't see awards as the purpose of Model UN. First and foremost, we believe that HMUN is a learning opportunity for delegates. So when we approach the way we run our committees, it's always from the perspective of giving the entire committee the best possible academic experience. This means that there's a constant tension between our goals as chairs and our duty to judge the debate and give awards fairly. In other words, in general, your HMUN India director is looking to make it harder for delegates to stand out, even while that director is looking for the delegates who do stand out. Our goal is to level the playing field as much as possible so that delegates, even if they're not being seriously considered for awards because they perhaps have less experience or are less well prepared, even those delegates are able to fully participate and have a meaningful experience in HMUN India. Now, our goal in terms of our preparation for conference is to elevate the level of debate so that we're not holding back delegates, so that the best delegates really are challenged and are having a meaningful experience in HMUN India. But I want to immediately dispel any notion that the dais is obsessively focused on awards and that every decision we make is tied to our ultimate awards decision. It's not. In general, the goal of the dais is to make the committee as enjoyable and as rewarding an experience for all of the delegates. That said, we do give awards, and we take giving awards very seriously because we understand how much of a premium our delegates place on the awards that we give. So my hope is that by explaining what it is that motivates us to give awards and the criteria that we use when we give those awards, I'll be able to see delegates across all committees acting in a way more in line with what their dais really wants from them. So going back to the initial point I was making about what might appear to be a tension between the dais running the committee and the dais judging the committee, there is one point where I think that even though that I've acknowledged this tension, the tension isn't actually there. And a recurring problem that we found at HMUN India is that delegates seem to think, or certain delegates seem to think, that the dais is being disingenuous when we ask delegates to conduct themselves in certain ways. That we're asking delegates to behave in a certain way, but ultimately what we really want is for them to ignore us. That's not the case. And I'm very much hoping that this video will make it easy for delegates to understand what we're actually thinking at the front of the room, and then as a result, tailor their behavior so that they are making positive contributions to the committee. And hopefully this leads to your winning awards, but ideally it will lead to you're having a smoother experience at H1 India, and you're generally being less stressed because you actually know what the dais is looking for and can more accurately judge your own performance. So So I hope the delegates will use this video both to prepare themselves to be better delegates, but also to make sense of the awards that are given in their committees after the fact, in the hopes that this will dispel a lot of doubt about why a particular delegate was or was not given an award. Okay, so that's the thinking behind giving this webinar. So, given that our goal is to make it clear what the dais is thinking, there are a few things that we should make explicit right off the bat. The reason that this webinar is called Introduction to Holistic Judging is because holistic judging is the system of judging delegates that we use at H1 India. Holistic judging means that we judge delegates based on an assessment of their performance relative to their peers and in the context of their committee over the course of the weekend. By the weekend, I mean over the course of the whole conference. So let me repeat that. We assess delegates based on their individual performance relative to their peers and in the context of the overall committee over the course of the entire conference. This means that we do not judge delegates based on any one particular aspect of the way that they participate in the committee. We also don't judge them based on a special rubric that weighs particular parts of their performance in the committee against one another. So I'm going to explain what it is that we don't do, and then I'm going to explain some of the philosophy behind holistic judging, and then hopefully tie it all together in a package that makes a lot of sense. And then after I've done this, then I will take questions from viewers. So, a question that I got last year when I was directing DISEC at H1 India that I frequently had to explain was the wrong way to think about the committee was, what matters more, my speaking or my performance in unmoderated caucus? And if you're unfamiliar with these terms, I really encourage you to watch our webinars on parliamentary procedure. There was a great one that was just completed by Aisha Shah last week, and then there will be another one in the coming weeks. So I'm going to assume in everything I say that delegates are familiar with all parts of H1 parliamentary procedure and our terminology, and if you're not, please review that before continuing with this webinar. So again, a common question that I received last year from my delegates is, which does H1 India place a higher value on? Your public speaking or your caucusing during unmoderated caucus, your negotiating with other delegates during unstructured debate? And the answer was neither. The answer is neither because we're not giving you an individual score for any component of your performance in committee. We're imagining you as a delegate at the United Nations trying to achieve a particular goal for your country, which means that we view public speaking, parliamentary procedure, research, negotiation during unmoderated caucuses, all as being different tools that the structure of the simulation has given you to realize that goal. I'm going to repeat that, and then I'm going to explain what I mean by that goal. Rather than giving you an individual score on your speaking, on your negotiating, on each individual speech, on the quantity of your research, H1 India is judging delegates based on how well they use all of the tools that the conference gives them, which includes their ability to make speeches, their ability to caucus during unmoderated caucuses, their ability to introduce research into their speeches or during unmoderated caucus. Use these tools to achieve the goal that their delegation has for the committee. And in general, this goal that delegates are trying to achieve is a political victory for their country on the international stage. In most committees, this means your goal as a delegate is to see the committee pass a resolution that most closely aligns with your policy while giving your country the prestige of having led the process that led to that agreement. And that's the mindset that you should be in when you're conducting yourself in committee. And if you put yourself through that lens, everything you do in committee makes sense. And the way that the chair sees it should also make sense. This really should be a moment of enlightenment for you if you haven't thought of your committee experience this way. Because as soon as you begin framing your participation in HMON through the lens of this holistic judging, everything that we expect of you immediately falls into place. You don't have to second guess yourself. Your goal in the committee is to get the committee to pass a resolution that you directed the committee toward writing and passing, so that your country gets what it wants out of the negotiations and gets to brag to, like, on the international stage that your country was a leader in the international community, which represents the opportunity to bring pride to your nation. You as a delegate, you as a debater, are only as significant as the amount of an impact you can make on the proceedings of the committee, so that the outcome of the committee favors your nation and gives your nation credit for having influence on the international stage. So then let's look at the different components of the conference in terms of this lens of holistic judging. What matters more, speaking or negotiating? Well, neither. The reason that you need to make good speeches isn't that we're judging how good your speeches are. You need to make good speeches because good speeches are persuasive. Good speeches are a signal of leadership to the rest of the committee. If you're working, let's say that there's a block in a committee that's the European Union block, and the European Union roughly agrees on policy, and so their delegates are caucusing together and are working on a working paper together. The delegate who not only makes the most eloquent speeches from that block, but who is able to package the ideas of the European Union so that they make sense to the rest of the committee and are compelling, that speaker is doing the best in that block because they're doing the most to increase the likelihood that the European bloc gets their resolution passed, gets the working paper turned into a draft resolution, and then gets that draft resolution passed by the committee. And they're making it so that other delegations, the representatives of other countries, are looking to this good speaker as a representative of their country, as a leader on what this whole collection of countries wants out of the negotiation, which represents prestige for that country that is being seen as the leader of the European Union. So let's say I'm the delegate of the the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union. Let's say that I'm the delegate of France. And I am consistently, effectively selling what the European Union bloc has been discussing and what we want out of the negotiations. I, as France, am increasing the likelihood that France's policies get adopted by the UN, because France's policies are the European Union bloc's policies, and if the European Union bloc becomes a popular voice in the committee and our ideas are recognized as good, then it's more likely that delegates will pass a resolution and France will get the credit. This represents national pride for France. France has now successfully gotten the international community to give the French people what they want and meet their interests. That has value in and of itself. So, sorry, I had technical difficulties for a second. Let me continue. So I've just explained the philosophy behind holistic judging, and now I'm going to make this more concrete. The best way to think about H1 India versus perhaps other conferences that you're familiar with. And actually, let me take it just one more step back. If it wasn't already clear, H1, and therefore by extension H1 India, is a very different conference from many of our peer conferences in South Asia. The first thing that you need to think about if you're an experienced Model UN delegate coming to H1 India is that most of what you think of as a Model UN conference is probably not applicable at H1, besides the fact that we are simulating the United Nations. Our philosophy is very different, our expectations are very different, and it's not just that our terminology and our parliamentary procedure is different, our expectations of delegates and what we consider to be a strong performance in our committees is materially different from that of conferences in our region, in other conferences in South Asia. Because we're basically importing a system that grew up in Boston, at H1 Boston, which has been going on for over 60 years, to H1 India. And our goal is to as closely replicate the H1 experience in India as we can. So a lot of what I'm saying is meant to help you understand the ways in which H1 India really is different from other conferences. So the first key framework that I'd encourage you to think about is H1 is first and foremost a negotiation, not a debate. And this is not a normative claim. I don't mean that there's anything wrong with debates. I mean specifically that the way that we see our competition, and we do definitely see it as a competition, is as a negotiation competition. And there's a huge difference between being successful in a negotiation competition and being successful in debate. And that difference comes down to the way that you respond to what other delegates present at the negotiation. In a debate, if I make a point, you will gain points. Sorry, I mean point in two ways. If I make an argument, you will gain credit by refuting my argument. If you can prove that I was wrong, then you have out-debated me. And this makes sense if there's an external person who is judging who between the two of us made the better argument. So, my understanding is that there are conferences in South Asia where that is definitely the framework. The chair or the director, the executive board, is the judge of the debate at other conferences. At H1 India, that is completely not how we see it. The role of the director is not to judge the debate, it's to facilitate the negotiation and then determine who came out the best from the negotiations, which means that it's outcome-focused, not argument-focused. Your goal as a delegate is not to make the most correct argument. It's to use argumentation, but also diplomacy, meaning compromise or deal forging or leadership, as in getting other delegates to look to you to tell them what to do, or to ensure that they're able to do the best possible work. Using those skills collectively, with no preference for any of them other than a recognition that all of them are useful tools. Using these skills to lead the committee toward an agreement that meets your country's interests. Put as simply as possible, if I'm a delegate at H1 India, the way that I win Best Delegate is by brokering an agreement that meets all of the terms that my country wanted out of the agreement. And I can get to that agreement by agreeing with delegates that have different policies. It doesn't matter that whether or not I prove the other delegates wrong. In fact, it's often a better strategy, although we don't have any particular preference for this is just my personal advice. It's often a better strategy not to argue against a delegate that you disagree with on certain points. Because if you can prove to that delegate that what they really agree on is your idea, or is an idea that has been forged by the committee, or that they really agree on the notion that compromise is important to making a lasting agreement, getting to that agreement is worth far more in the eyes of an H1 India director than proving that the other person was wrong. Because there's no credit for proving that another delegate is wrong when the outcome of proving that they're wrong is that the United Nations passes a resolution that you argued against, but that ultimately goes against your country's interests. So, by extension, this means that if I'm making a speech, the goal of my speech shouldn't be to prove that I am right. Because that's isolating. I can't pass a resolution with one vote. No one is judging me on whether or not I am right. I'm being judged on whether or not I can get other delegates to help me get a resolution passed that meets my interests and lead them to that process. So I need to make speeches that persuade other delegates that I'm right. And I can do that I don't have to prove other delegates wrong to prove that I'm right in that context. I'm almost better off proving that I have figured out what everyone really is getting at in their speeches. So for example, if a group of delegates, so if there's been debate on some issue and there have been many different proposals for a particular plan. So let me think of an example from this conference. So DISEC this year, Sarah Anderson's committee is debating I think I might be slightly wrong on this, the future of state boundaries in the Middle East. So let's say 10 different delegates get up and each present a well-researched, persuasive plan for what state boundaries in the Middle East could look like. That's actually just good. That's not considered being an excellent delegate. Any one of those speeches assessed in isolation might be good, but the dais is never judging your speeches in isolation. They're always judging everything you do in context, and they're ultimately basing their rewards on your holistic performance, meaning your collective performance and what it sums up to. The sum needing to be greater than the sum of its parts. So the best delegate speech, after you've heard 10 speeches that are all presenting different detailed plans for what state boundaries in the Middle East should look like, the 11th delegate gets up and says, it seems like everyone here ultimately agrees that the decision about the future of state boundaries needs to come from the states in the Middle East. And I've seen that in this argument, and here's a plan that ties together everything everyone has been saying. That delegate, by moving the committee toward an agreement that meets that delegate's interests, presumably, like that's a requirement for their saying this in a speech. They're not just getting their idea out. They're increasing the likelihood that other delegates work with them, look to them to forge the compromise, and give them power to control the outcome of the negotiation, which is what they really care about, the outcome, and they're having control over that outcome. So again, now, unmoderated caucus is a lot more common at H1 India than it is at a lot of our peer conferences. But that doesn't mean that we judge unmoderated caucus as more important than speeches, or that we place a relatively greater weight on unmoderated caucus. Rather, we see both speeches and unmoderated caucus as tools that delegates have to further their success in the negotiation, either by building consensus or by negotiating with other blocs. So we're not giving you a separate I know I'm repeating myself, but I think that once I've given you the information, repeating myself will make it clearer. We are not giving you a separate score on your speeches or a separate score on unmoderated caucus. We're seeing, did you use your speeches and then unmoderated caucus as a collective set of resources to increase the likelihood that your country succeeded in the negotiation? So, okay, yeah, so I see there was a question from Tanushree DPS that was exactly what I was just explaining. So I'm glad that I did repeat myself then. Yeah, so I'll say this again explicitly. The idea is not that these components are equal or these components are separately ranked. The whole point is that we don't rank anything, equally or not equally. What we care about is the outcome of the whole weekend of debate. So everything that you do in committee is about using the tool of the committee to achieve your goal, which is to succeed in a negotiation in getting an agreement passed that is as close to your national interest as possible and getting credit from the international community for having forged that agreement, which leads to national pride. Okay. Now I want to talk about research. So one of the big recurring points of confusion that I think a lot of delegates have at H1 India is we don't care about the quantity of your research when we're deciding awards. And I mean that to be extreme, and it's also not 100% what I mean, but I think it's good to hear it. Because if I say it in that jarring way, I think that will give you the pause you need to understand how we view research. Yes, we care that you do a lot of research, but we aren't judging you on your research, and no one is going to be more likely to give you an award because you did so much research. Proving that you have done research is worth 0 points at H1 India. 0. Not that we give points at all, which is the whole point of holistic judging. But your score in holistic judging does not go up because you have done more research. You do research because it increases the likelihood that you are going to be seen as a leader in the committee, that you're going to submit a strong proposal in negotiation, and that the outcome that you receive from this negotiation is going to align with your national interests. If you have done research that has given you the ability to make a very compelling, fact-based case for a really detailed solution that you've been able to put into your working paper and then put into a resolution, and that becomes a focus of the committee, you're drawing a lot of attention to your country and its leadership in the international community. You're increasing the likelihood that other delegates will support your resolution because you're making a more compelling case that you really will solve the problem. And you know that whatever you're implementing will be more likely to have a positive impact on your country, because that's why you proposed it in the first place at the UN. Excuse me. So, again, research is a tool. It's a tool of persuasion. It's a tool for ensuring that your proposal in the form of your working paper and your draft resolution is as strong as possible, making it more likely that people will support your idea at the expense of the ideas in other working papers and draft resolutions. And it increases the likelihood that what you propose really is in your national interest, in that it increases the likelihood that the resolution is a good solution to the problem facing your country. We are judging you based on your ability to use your research to achieve those goals. We're not judging you at all on the fact that you've done the research. Similarly, we're not judging you at all on the quantity of facts that you know or that you introduce in your speeches. Because no one at the UN gets any credit for knowing facts. That's considered a baseline. Also, there are real political costs to having a debate about facts at the UN when it's irrelevant to the actual outcome of the negotiation. This is a big reason. So this is a point where our parliamentary procedure being different really reflects an underlying philosophical difference between our conference and our peers in India. So we don't have anything like a point of order. Sorry, we do have a point of order, but point of order at H1 India refers to a very specific thing. Point of order means that the director has messed up parliamentary procedure. So if the director skips a name on the speaker's list, that's when you use a point of order to correct the director's mistake in parliamentary procedure. Similarly, we don't have any point of information. The points that we do have are point of inquiry, or point of parliamentary inquiry, which is the full official name, which allows you to ask a question of the dais about parliamentary procedure. So that's when you would ask, like, when will the dais be accepting working papers? Point of parliamentary inquiry. And then point of personal privilege, human being outside of the simulation and suffering in some way, point of personal privilege, it's too hot in the room, can we turn on the air conditioning? So those are the 3 points. Point of order, correct the chair's parliamentary procedure. Point of personal privilege, I personally need something, but not in my capacity as a delegate at H1 India, just in my capacity as a human being. And point of parliamentary inquiry, I have a question to the dais about parliamentary procedure. So what you'll notice is that there is no point for calling out other delegates' factual inaccuracies. There is no point for calling out other delegates' factual inaccuracies. And trying to do so through parliamentary procedure is almost certainly a waste of your time. And that should be intuitive at this point in the webinar. Why would your country waste time pointing out that another delegate's facts are incorrect unless that would substantially impact the outcome of the negotiation? Because you're certainly going to alienate that delegate unless the reason you're pointing out a mistake in their facts isn't just to prove that they're wrong, but to demonstrate to them that what they actually want is what you're proposing, not what they're proposing, because of a discrepancy in the facts. So for example, if a delegate says, we can't support this plan, it's going to lead to $10 billion in costs every year, and you say, no, actually, that's a mistaken interpretation of the facts, it will only cost $1 billion every year, that makes it completely sustainable, that is a brilliant use of facts. Because then you're using your research to make an argument that the other delegate should change their stance because your facts are better than their facts. But let's say that you were in, again, dais, and the delegate of the United States gets up and makes a speech about the importance of combating the threat from the Islamic State, which has 100,000 active fighters in Iraq and Syria. So this is the speech made by the United States. And then the delegate of the United Kingdom gets up and says, delegates, the delegate of the United States is absolutely incorrect. The correct number of fighters in the Islamic State is 70,000. 70,000, not 100,000. Thank you. It should be clear that under holistic judging, the United Kingdom has done absolutely nothing worthy of recognition. The United Kingdom has, first of all, in this example, attacked their ideological ally over. So it's in the United Kingdom's interests as a state for other delegates to believe the United States, even if the United States' facts are wrong, according to the United Kingdom. Because the fact that the United Kingdom presents in this example is that ISIS is smaller, whereas we know that the United States and the United Kingdom would both like the UN to take action against ISIS, or the Islamic State. So, one, correcting the fact went against the United Kingdom's national interest. Two, it likely alienated the delegate of the United States, who has now been called out by the delegate of the United Kingdom in a very undiplomatic way, when this is a delegate that agrees with the United Kingdom and would probably support the same compromise resolution. And three, it doesn't change the outcome of the negotiation in a way that favors the United Kingdom. Who is going to change their stance just because the United States was off by a factor of 30%? on the size of a large terror force. But if the United Kingdom really did have a compelling reason to draw that distinction, then they should frame their argument in terms of leveraging that fact as a tool of persuasion, not to prove to the director that they know the correct number. Because the director doesn't care if you know the correct number for the sake of knowing the correct number. Now, the director will care if you use incorrect facts, but it is the job of the director, who is the substantive expert of the committee, to penalize delegates for saying things that are false. It's usually not in the delegate's interest to waste their precious speaking time on correcting another delegate's facts for the sake of correcting the facts. So, to sum this all up, research in holistic judging is seen as a tool that delegates use to increase the likelihood that the outcome of the negotiation is a substantively compelling document that meets that country's national interest. The point of research is not to prove to the director that you've done it, because you'll only be penalized for having not done research. You will not be rewarded just for having done research. You will only be rewarded for having done research if you turn that research into an outcome in the negotiation that favors your national interest. Okay. And I've got one last section, and then I will take any questions that you might have. Although it seems like the early morning was not a very good time, so we don't have a lot of live viewers. So the last point, circling back to the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that there's a tension in running a committee between making the committee work for the delegates that are really in contention for awards and elevating the delegates that aren't doing well enough to be seriously considered for awards but still should have a meaningful academic experience. So I want to talk about how to relate to your dais given what our real expectations are of delegates and what we're really thinking. I was a high school delegate once too, and I have a lot of beliefs about my diocese that I have discovered are false now that I am on the other side all the time. And I'm hoping to use this last part of the webinar to dispel those. First is that the dais has biases for or against particular delegates. At HMUN, we work very hard to make sure that that is not the case. If the dais seems to be behaving in a way that appears to be biased against you, it is almost certainly in your head. There's a phenomenon that's part of international relations that has a really significant application in Model UN. So it's this theory of the asymmetric misperception. And this is a concept that is relevant to my committee, so for any of my delegates who are tuning into this webinar, this should be interesting to you. So the case study is in the late 1970s, relations between communist China and communist Vietnam deteriorate. And this seems confusing because China propped Vietnam up during the Vietnam War against the United States. Why do these two communist countries suddenly hate each other? And one explanation is this concept of asymmetric misperception. China is a much larger, much more powerful country than Vietnam. This means that there's a fundamental asymmetry in the relationship between China and Vietnam. They are not equivalent. Vietnam has to view China as a really important country And Vietnam's relationship with China is one of its most important relationships. So the top people in Vietnam are attuned to their relationship with China. Whereas on the flip side, Vietnam is not that important to China. And so it's people lower down the totem pole in the Chinese hierarchy that are focused on Vietnam. And Chinese policy is not designed around what would Vietnam think. But both sides are inclined to make the mistake of thinking that the other side weighs the relationship about the same way. Which means that if China takes actions that Vietnam sees as aggressive, so in this case, China reduces foreign aid to Vietnam after the Vietnam War, China is not thinking about its policies in terms of its relationship with Vietnam. It's thinking about its overall international relations, and Vietnam is just a small part of that. But China cutting its aid to Vietnam is a catastrophic blow to Vietnam, and there's an irresistible desire on the part of the Vietnamese to see this lessening of aid to Vietnam as a direct attack on the Vietnamese national project, which leads Vietnam to respond by expelling its Chinese minority, because China can't be trusted, and so the Chinese in Vietnam can't be trusted. And China sees this as an extreme provocation. Why would our ally, to whom we're still giving foreign aid, expel our foreign nationals? Like, because we lowered foreign aid to them? That doesn't make sense. That was not against Vietnam. That was because we had to spend the money elsewhere. And so this pattern continues, and then the relationship completely deteriorates. This is a very good model for the relationship between the dais, the executive board, and the delegates. Everything that the dais does seems personal to you, and it's definitely not, because the dais is concerned about running a committee for sometimes hundreds of delegates, or at H1, 195 delegates in the General Assemblies. And this means that a lot of what we do because it's expedient and because it will meet the overall interests of the committee, and we don't think about how it would be perceived by each individual delegate to nearly the same extent the delegates experiencing it do. So to give an example, if I'm a delegate in a committee and I feel like the chair is just not calling on me, I care so much about the fact that I'm going to speak, I have to assume that the director is intentionally not calling on me. But almost certainly the director is not intentionally not calling on you. Either you're not being called on because you've already spoken and the director's trying to call on more delegates, or the director doesn't realize they're not calling on you, and then you should just tell the director they're not calling on you in a note that's polite. So, building on that, in terms of your relationship with the dais, you should always think about the dais' core interest is to lead a simulation that is academically enriching for every delegate. You can become an ally of the dais in that endeavor, instead of thinking of the dais as this ominous threat. And this is a major reason why, once you've been on the dais before at other conferences, you tend to become a better delegate afterwards, because you understand the struggles that the dais has. So, for example, when I'm a delegate in a committee, I'm always thinking, how do I make it easier for my dais to lead this committee? And then how do I be the delegate that helps the dais run the committee? And in certain cases, I mean, you're not necessarily judged on that, but there are ways in which your being an asset to the dais really does make you a better delegate. So, for example, I guess a good way of thinking about this, I know there are a lot of delegates who think that demonstrating mastery of parliamentary procedure is a criteria for awards. It's not. Misusing parliamentary procedure will annoy the dais, but because it slows down the committee. Using parliamentary procedure correctly is a baseline requirement, and introducing, for example, like really interesting motions that don't pass will hurt you, because you're not increasing the likelihood that the committee passes a resolution that meets your national interest. It's really that simple. Just put everything through that test. Will doing this increase the likelihood that the committee passes a resolution that meets my national interest? No, I probably shouldn't do it. But there is a version of using parliamentary procedure that does both make the lives of the chairs easier and increase the likelihood that the committee passes a resolution that meets your national interest. And that's introducing motions that capture what the committee actually wants to debate to increase the likelihood that the committee looks to you as a leader. And if the committee looks to you as a leader, it's more likely that the committee will take your ideas seriously, and if they take your ideas seriously, it's more likely that those ideas will end up in the final negotiation document, which means it's more likely that, you guessed it, you'll meet your national interest in the negotiation. So for example, after an unmoderated caucus, there's a very high chance that the motion that will pass immediately after an unmoderated caucus has concluded is motion for a moderated caucus of however long speaking time to discuss the outcome of the unmoderated caucus. Because that's what everyone is thinking about in the committee. Making that motion cuts down on the time it takes for the dais to move the committee forward, because the dais wants the committee to share what happened during the unmoderated caucus in formal debate. Making a motion to talk about an arcane topic that you've researched that no one else wants to debate and will therefore never get a majority of delegates electing to debate doesn't win you any points, because it just delays the committee because you have to vote down that proposal rather than making the motion that's going to pass that speeds up the committee and proves to the other delegates that you have their interests at heart, because you're making the motion that will help them debate better. And then sucking up to the dais. It's always astonishing to me how much high school delegates really think that the directors don't know when delegates are sucking up to them. And I'm sorry to be so harsh about this, but I need to say this explicitly. And when I say sucking up, I mean that is like not a profane term. I mean that I'm actually not sure if that's culturally insensitive to say, but in the United States, that's not considered a profane way to describe it. Your goal should not be to ingratiate yourself to the dais, because the dais wants to facilitate the debate for all of the delegates. Any time that you're spending just to develop goodwill with the dais without furthering the interests of the committee is time that you are personally responsible for the dais being unable to do their job effectively, which is not going to help you win an award. Similarly, sending your research to the dais to prove to the dais that you've done your research, as I've said, not worth any credit, because we don't care that you have the research. We care that you're using the research. And then as a final note, your interactions with the dais should be constructive. You shouldn't necessarily live in perpetual fear of your dais. If you can make a compelling case to your dais in legitimate channels that you have something to offer that will make the committee better, your dais will at least entertain it. And if your dais shoots it down, it's not personal. You're just one of many delegates in the committee, and the dais needs to focus on running the committee for everyone. And you should not commit the asymmetric misperception fallacy of assuming that it's personal, because of how much it matters to you. Okay, that's all for me. Unfortunately, there are no viewers right now, so I can't actually field questions. But if you have any questions about how holistic judging works, please send them to committees@hmunindia.org. That's committees@hmunindia.org, and I'll be very happy to explain it to you. Okay. Thank you so much. I know this is a a really tough love webinar. I firmly believe that by making our expectations as explicit as possible, it will significantly improve the likelihood that delegates are able to maximize their experience at HMN India and will not feel like they're struggling to understand the expectations of the dais or understand the awards that are ultimately selected by the dais after the fact. And actually, I do have one viewer. One viewer, do you have any questions? If you do, please post them in the chat, and I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Otherwise, the webinar's over. Okay, so the question was, what specifically do chairs look for in a good delegate, and how much does lobbying account for your total delegate score? So first, I definitely highly encourage you to watch the whole webinar. Okay, so especially in large committees like the General Assembly. So I'll focus this part on the General Assembly point, and then the answer to your question, I know that for context for other viewers, someone just tuned in and asked a question that was answered earlier on in the webinar. So my advice to that delegate is to watch the recording that will be posted. But they also asked to tailor my answer specifically to the General Assembly, which I haven't done, so I will do that right now. So General Assembly committees are particularly, I think, stressful for a lot of delegates to HMN India because of how big they are. And I think that there's a perception that the number of times you speak is directly proportionate to how well you're doing in the committee, and therefore not being able to speak feels like there's no way for you to do well. That is the completely wrong way to think about it. First of all, the only reason that the director is tallying how many times that delegates speak is to try to prevent any delegate from speaking significantly more than other delegates. So, and then by the same token, if a delegate is speaking significantly more than other delegates who are trying to speak, the director is very well aware that's because the director called on that delegate multiple times. So the director is not giving any delegate bonus points for speaking more. If anything, the director is penalizing the delegate in proportion to the amount of extra credit they get for being able to speak more. Like, oh, of course that delegate got a lot of points out. I called on that delegate more than I was supposed to. I'm not going to factor that into my awards decision. So in terms of also answering this question, I would strongly encourage delegates who are curious specifically about how awards work in the General Assembly to watch both this full webinar and Sarah Anderson's webinar from last week. Or I'm sorry, I think she hasn't done it yet. Her upcoming webinar on how to succeed in the General Assembly. And that will complement this nicely if you're specifically thinking about how to win awards in General Assembly committees. But we don't give a particular score to your speeches or your performance in unmoderated caucus. What we are looking to evaluate is how successfully you're able to rally the committee around your ideas and lead the committee toward a negotiated resolution that favors your interests. Okay, I'm being told Sarah's webinar was yesterday. Okay. So again, all the webinars are recorded, so eventually all of them will be on YouTube, and you should be able to find answers to most of your questions by going through the different webinars that are recorded. I know a lot of these are inconveniently timed, and so hopefully once they're all online, people will be able to benefit from the full suite. Yeah, so I know that doesn't fully answer your question, because a lot of what's in your question, viewer, is what the first 40 minutes of the webinar were about. But that specific component to the General Assembly Committee is the huge variation in the amount that people speak, because some people will only get to speak maybe once or twice for the entire conference, whereas someone who speaks 5 times in the whole conference has almost tripled the amount that other delegates have spoken. That doesn't factor into our awards decision. Unless the reason that that delegate gets so much speaking time is that other delegates are yielding to that delegate, which is a signal of how much influence that delegate wields and the likelihood that that delegate is going to see an outcome of the committee that favors their national interests. But then, again, they're not getting the points because they're speaking. They're getting the points because of what their speaking represents in the context of the simulation. And then as a final concluding remark on something that I haven't mentioned yet, when you're interacting with your fellow delegates, treat them as if you are a diplomat engaging with them at the UN. And this is a very specific point. This isn't just treat them like, you're in a negotiation in a political forum, in any set of political fora. You are specifically at the UN. If you offend another delegate, you create a diplomatic incident. Is technicality in international law matters encouraged? It is, if that's constructive to reaching an agreement that favors your interests. So if technicality in the text of your working papers and draft resolutions is an asset to the extent that it increases the likelihood that the resolution will be implementable, will meet your national interests, or will be well received by the other delegates. But the director is not going to give you credit just because your arguments were technical. The fact that your arguments are technical needs to lead to your being able to position yourself more effectively in debate. It needs to increase the likelihood that other delegates are persuaded by your arguments and want to work with you toward a compromise negotiation on the text of the working paper or on the draft resolution. It needs to help you establish yourself as an authority on the text of the resolution. So, for example, a really effective way to use a legal technical argument would be to argue against another resolution on the floor that is against your policies, like fundamentally against your policies, such that your country could never accept that as a compromise, rather than just another proposal that is slightly different from your own. Arguing that other policy violates principles of international law. And I want to clarify that distinction again. So let's say that it is the third day of the committee and there are 3 draft resolutions on the floor. And by this point, the draft resolutions should be mutually exclusive, such that from a policy perspective, I would be going against my national interests to vote for any resolution other than the one I'm currently sponsoring. Sorry, not sponsoring, currently supporting. Then making a technical legal argument for why it would be illegal to pass another one of the draft resolutions is an extraordinarily effective argument to undecided voters. I was in a committee as a delegate on the U.S. college circuit this year where I made an argument that another draft resolution violated the principles of the World Trade Organization, and it would be illegal for delegates to vote for it. And that was a compelling argument. But the reason it was compelling is that it led to other delegates in the committee coming up to me and asking me to change the text of their draft resolution to meet my interests so that it would be legal to pass their draft resolution. I wasn't getting the credit because I made the legal argument. I was getting the credit because making a legal argument increased the likelihood that my influence would lead to a compromise resolution being passed that met my national interests, which is the whole thesis of holistic judging. Yeah, so again, international law is relevant in a lot of different contexts, but the reason to bring it up isn't that it's relevant. You can't bring it up if it's irrelevant, but you don't have to bring it up just because it's relevant. You bring it up if it is useful to your country in this particular simulation of this particular discussion to use international law to achieve a particular outcome in the negotiation. Sorry, I'm not sure if I clearly stated the question. So the question was, what if there are issues in the resolution that conflict with international law matters, such as the Geneva or Vienna Conventions? Could you bring up international law? And my answer was, yes, you could, but you don't bring it up just because it's relevant. You bring it up if it's relevant, and it will help you achieve the outcome you want from the negotiations. And just the big summary of this talk, and the big difference between holistic judging and other forms of judging, is that your goal as a delegate is not to be the most right. It's to be the most effective at winning a political victory in a negotiation for your country. And you can be right and still lose the important battle if, in the process of being right, you miss the opportunity to influence the outcome of the committee. And the committee ends up passing a resolution that goes against your interests. Okay. That's all for me. Thank you guys. I hope this was helpful. And again, if you have any questions, email committees@h1india.org.